This is Learning to Listen, Conversations for Change, and I'm your host, Joshua Sparrow at the Brazelton Touchpoint Center. To find out more about the Brazelton Touchpoint Center and Learning to Listen, go to brazeltontouchpoints.org and click on Learn with Us and look for Learning to Listen in the Conversations section. There's also a link there to our archive of Learning to Listen conversations over the years. To learn more about and register for more Brazelton Touchpoint Center conversations, events, and trainings, click on the link in the chat. To join the Brazelton Touchpoint Center's Learning Network, look for that link in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us today from Maine to California by way of North Carolina, West Virginia, Alabama, and Texas. With folks tuning in from Italy and South Africa. Thank you all for being here for today's important conversation, because today we'll be learning with attorney Julia Olson, co-executive director and chief legal counsel of Our Children's Trust. We'll learn about its innovative legal strategy and how Julia Olson and her colleagues partner with health professionals to stop the climate change crisis, which is one of the single greatest drivers of health for children today. But first, a bit of information about today's Learning to Listen episode. Nearly 700 of us have registered for today's webinar, so please do feel free to tell us about you, where you're from, and what you do in the chat. Our superb interpreter, Maria Jose Gutierrez, is joining us from Bogota, Colombia, and she will be simultaneously translating our webinar in Spanish. Thank you, Maria Jose. To access the translation, click on the interpretation icon in your Zoom controls. Then select Spanish. To mute the English in the background, select Mute Original Audio. La conversación de hoy será en español y inglés. En los controles de esa reunión, haga clic en Interpretación. Haga clic en el idioma que le gustaría escuchar. Para escuchar solo el español, haga clic en Silenciar Audio Original. To turn closed captioning on, just click on the closed caption icon in your Zoom controls and select Show Subtitle. You can adjust the size of the subtitles. Now, please use the chat feature if you have a comment to share or need help with a technical issue, and put your questions for Julia Olson in the Q&A box. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, please be sure you complete the feedback survey. That survey will open in your web browser when this webinar ends, and you'll also receive a link to the survey tomorrow in our thank you email to you. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors, the Burke Foundation, Cambridge Trust, and Berkshire Bank, and of course, our Brazelton Touchpoint Center production team, Isabella Mantilla, Michael Accardi, and Suzanne Okasik. And now I'd like to introduce today's guest, Julia Olson. Attorney Julia Olson is the co-executive director and chief legal counsel of Our Children's Trust, which is a nonprofit public interest law firm she founded in 2010 on the idea that courts are vital to democracy and are empowered to protect our children and the planet. Without a stable climate system, every natural resource we rely upon to exercise our basic human rights for life, liberty, home, and happiness, they're all under threat. Julia Olson and Our Children's Trust are recipients of the Rose Walters Prize for Global Environmental Activism. Attorney Olson received the Kerry Rydberg Award for Environmental Activism in 2017 and the Katharine and George Alexander Law Prize in 2022. She is a member of Rachel's Network Circle of Advisors, named in honor of the great environmentalist Rachel Carson, and that is also a community of women committed to a safer, healthier, and more just world for all. In founding Our Children's Trust, Julia Olson initiated a global movement of rights-based climate litigation. She and her colleagues have since pioneered a globally replicated model for youth-led legal action that draws from and integrates children's rights, constitutional rights, climate science, and the public trust doctrine to protect the planet's most vulnerable citizens, children. In 2023, following the Children's Trust's win in the first ever constitutional climate trial in the United States, known as Held versus the State of Montana, Time magazine called Julia Olson one of the world's 100 most influential leaders driving climate action. Julia Olson, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to especially thank Joshua and the Brazelton Touchpoint Center for inviting me to share the story of our Children's Trust and my story. We are incredibly honored to be able to work on behalf of and alongside youth from across the United States and globally. And so I'm looking forward to sharing those stories today. And before I invite you into our work, I just wanted to ask everyone, wherever you are, if you would just consider putting your feet on the ground or settling into your bodies in whatever way works for you. I like to put my feet on the ground and get grounded as we enter into this conversation. And I'm just going to invite you to take a couple of deep breaths and try to fill your lungs and your torso, and then elongate your exhale and really just slowly let your breath out. And please feel free to keep doing that as you settle in and come into this space today. And I offer just that up really briefly because that's something that we do as an organization. We actually work with a trauma consultant on our team. And we do that because the world we live in has a lot of trauma. There's a lot of violence and hardship. We have a tense election here in the US coming up. And the youth we work with experience a lot of trauma. And we'll talk about some of that today. And so we practice these tools and bring them to our staff and to the young people we advocate with, because we have to build these tools of resilience and dealing in a more trauma-sensitive way with our world today. So tune into your breath whenever you need to as we go. And I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to dive in. All right. So our Children's Trust we are here doing this work on the planet to secure a livable climate and world for our young people, and really do that by protecting their fundamental constitutional rights. And Josh asked me to tell you a little bit of the story of how I got to this work. And so I'll share a little bit about me as we dive in here. I grew up in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and I am a mountain lover. And so when I went to law school back in the 90s, my goal and dream was to do environmental law, which I did for about the first 12 years of my career. And in that work, I sued the government a lot. I worked under most of our major environmental federal laws and worked to protect the West. And then I had babies. So my first son was born in 2004, and that's him in this photo alongside the Merced River in Yosemite, which was a special place to me where I worked. And what I came to understand about what was happening with the climate crisis is, I understood it as a young person and as a working environmental lawyer. And I was bringing cases to try to address climate change. But it was all through this environmental lens. And I was doing what I've come to understand was a bit of defensive whack-a-mole. So, one project would pop up in one place and we'd win a case and stop it. And then another would pop up in sort of a different manifestation. And when I had my own children, I really saw the world through their eyes and just saw the innocence and the hope and the curiosity. And it really hit me hard in those years about the planet that we were leaving for our young ones. And I decided that I needed to make a shift in my career and use my law degree in a different way. And what really was illuminated for me is that children and their rights, their rights to life and liberty and happiness and safety and opportunity and joy, all of those things were threatened by the climate emergency. And at the heart of it was government, because our governments were really perpetuating the crisis and really furthering this fossil fuel energy system that was at the heart of it. So that's why in 2010, I founded this organization, Our Children's Trust. And that was the moment I really pinned my transition from environmental law to human rights law or civil rights law. And at the core, we are trying to secure the fundamental rights to life and liberty for children and all future generations of children. And in that work, we have 3 core pillars, and I'll talk a little bit more about these as I go and I share some stories of our work. But the first is we are really powered by science. We trust scientists. We are always looking to the best cutting edge science that's out there. I'll talk about one new piece of scientific evidence today. And it's crucial to all the work that we do that we are bringing in the best experts from the field of climate science and everything that encompasses, including sea level rise or drought, increasing storm events, all the different areas of expertise involved in understanding the climate emergency, to the ramifications to humans. So we work with a lot of physicians and pediatricians, public health experts, psychiatrists, and then the solution side. So we bring in energy transition experts and people who are really looking at how do we address this problem. And then, of course, lots of lawyers and policymakers and so forth. We also just absolutely trust and believe in children and their ability to see clearly the world that they want. They understand their rights in a way that I think a lot of adults and sometimes lawyers don't even fully grapple with. And our goal is to lift up their voices and elevate their stories and give them a platform to really share what they're experiencing in their lives and what they want for their future. And we do that in a lot of different ways, bringing them into cases in courtrooms as part of that, but we're also bringing them into the halls of Congress to testify. We're giving them opportunities to be interviewed by the New York Times, to speak at a big event, and all sorts of other platforms that I'll talk about a little bit more. And then we still really believe in democracy and the power of 3 branches of government working together, and the courts being a really important component of democracy, particularly when we're looking at the violation or infringement of fundamental constitutional rights. The courts they're the bulwark, they're the guardians of our constitutional rights. And so that's why we really work in the courts. In the beginning of this work, I was often asked, why children? And I think any pediatrician can answer that question. And Lisa Patel serves on our board and has said that the climate crisis is the single biggest driver of the health for every child born today. And so we are representing them. And another reason we're representing them is there are 74 million children in the United States alone who have no vote, so who are under the age of 18. And just to put that in context, there were 74 million 74 million voters who voted for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. So it just gives you a little inkling of the power imbalance in terms of adults who hold political power and children who don't. And we think children deserve to really have their rights as part of the discussion going forward. in our cases, many of which are about the equal protection of the law and children not having equal rights. So if you think about cases like Brown versus Board of Education here in the United States from 1954, that was a time when children went to court to say, we have the right to be in integrated schools and not have segregation inform our education. And today, children are saying we have the right to have the kind of natural world and climate system protected in the way that adults have had in their lives. This is really important for children because they're not just small humans, as you know. It's not just a matter of age, but it's a matter of physiology and children's bodies and brains being more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. So the fact that they still have their developing lungs and their brains and their immune systems, they're particularly sensitive to things like heat or smoke or extreme events like flooding and increased exposure to infectious disease processes and vectors. So all of those things make children's bodies more harmed and injured from the climate crisis than adults. Children are also way more dependent on caregivers and politicians to protect them. They don't have their own money to lobby, and they are politically powerless. One of my clients has said, and she's actually in this photo, she said, I don't even have a driver's license. Like my mobility is limited. So children are just affected in a lot of different ways in terms of this changing climate system. And then, of course, they will live with the consequences of the decisions that we make today far longer because of life expectancy. Many of them will be alive at the end of the century and beyond. And then children have faced a long history of discrimination. So just like certain races, African Americans or women, children also have just a very long history of not having their rights protected, and that is now starting to change. But the law really centers adults. So it's something to think about when we think about rights and law. So turning again to one of the really key impacts to children that we bring forward in all of our cases is the mental health injuries that young people sustain. So this is a map from a report or a study that was just published, I think it was early this week. It's in the Lancet. And it was a survey of, I think, around 16,000 American youth, really looking at the mental health impacts of climate change. This is the second study of its kind. The first one was done on the global level, and now we have a US-specific study. And what this research shows across the board is that the vast majority of young people are at least moderately worried about climate change, and typically over 50% are extremely worried. And that results in things like increased anxiety, depression, rates of suicidality, just a lot of challenges for this young generation. And what the psychiatrists we work with say is that these are not disorders, right? This is like a natural human response to an emergency that the young people are very much aware of. And so we don't want to characterize it as something that's wrong with them. It's actually a healthy response to what's happening to the planet. And there are a lot of ways we can support young people so that those impacts aren't as significant. I'm going to just really briefly show you this one science slide on the physical science side of the climate crisis. It's one that really motivated and informed me early on in my work. And it just shows, many of you have probably seen the hockey stick curve of the rise of carbon dioxide. And what this graph shows is that for hundreds of thousands of years, carbon dioxide levels fluctuated up and down within a certain range. And that range where humanity developed was around 280 parts per million. We're now at about 421. And that rise is just, in geologic times, it's just like a rocket ship going straight up. And the problem with that rise in carbon dioxide pollution from burning fossil fuels is that it correlates really directly with temperature rise. So when carbon dioxide levels are higher, the Earth is warmer. When they're lower, the Earth is cooler. And then, of course, ice responds to heat. And so the seas will rise as the ice melts, and that takes longer to occur, but it's why we're starting to see the rising seas. And then that heat causes all sorts of other conditions, like increased storm events, as we've seen in the Southeast and the United States during the hurricane season. So I'm going to turn now, shift a little bit away from the science piece and dig into the law a bit and the stories of some of our youth and the successes they're having. And this is a map that shows some of our active cases. And then the states where you see our Children's Trust logo are cases that are under development right now. So we're working across the United States, and we're also working globally. This case it's called Held versus the state of Montana. It's named after Ricky Held, who is in that picture there. And this was a really amazing special case because it was the first in the country, in the United States, to go to a trial where the youth were able to testify and where all of the experts also took the stand. So this happened in the summer of 2023. It was just over a week long. And the result of this case was a judge in state court in Montana finding that the state of Montana had laws on the books that were requiring the state to basically approve fossil fuel projects while ignoring climate change impacts. And the court said that those laws were unconstitutional under the Montana state constitution because they were violating the rights of these young people to life and health and safety and dignity and equal protection of the law and the right to a clean and healthful environment. So it was a really huge win just over a year ago after this incredible trial of the whole story of how climate crisis and the use of fossil fuels is affecting these 16 youth and other young people across the state. And so I wanted you to just have an opportunity to hear a little bit from them in their words.
I believe that Montanans, regardless of party, regardless of where they're from, regardless of what they do, deserve to have this beautiful place that we all love so much.
Montana has a tradition of experiencing the outdoors, loving nature, and at the same time, a fossil fuel industry that is pushing in the other direction.
It will go down in history as the first ever constitutional climate trial. There's a big weight and responsibility that comes with that.
Not every state has a right to a clean and healthful environment in their constitution.
It's not about the government being wrong or these people being evil. It's about changing an unhealthy pattern of behavior that's harming Montana's people.
This trial is barely about our generation right now. We know it's about our futures, but it's about future generations too. We're fighting for them, not just us.
All these 16 youth plaintiff heroes are courageously leading us, speaking truth to power. They are here to save us from ourselves, because we, my friends, are handing them a mess.
I'm trying to protect this environment for future generations to come. You know, it's really scary to see what you care for disappear right in front of your eyes.
It's a photo of our property when the smoke is coming to the valley and you can't see the mountains. It's horrifying.
I think every single one of us is here because we care about the future, and we want a future where our kids and our grandkids can grow up and be proud of what we did. We didn't shrink in the face of this threat. We stepped up to it.
I just think it's like a beautiful thing that all of us love Montana in different ways, and I want the judge to realize that more than anything.
I don't know if I can live in Bozeman or in the other towns in Montana that I know and love because of the uncertainty that they'll even exist in the same way that they do to me now, that they will in the future.
Like every time I come back home, it just feels so real, and I don't know how to explain it, but there's just cycles of life going on here, and it's not just on paper.
I think a lot of us working on this trial felt a huge responsibility to do it right. Governments are required to abide by the Constitution, and I think what that means on the ground is we'll start seeing governments, implement these rulings, and that means moving away from fossil fuels and moving towards renewable energy systems.
Sit there for a minute. Really, it's hard to describe how amazing that experience was for these young people and for the experts and for our whole team. And we do have a Montana trial website. So if you go to our website, you can actually watch the trial testimony because the judge allowed cameras in the courtroom. So you can see the pediatrician testifying or the psychiatrist or any of the climate scientists, as well as the youth telling their stories. So I encourage you to check that out. And then this summer, we had another really incredible victory. Following in the footsteps of the Montana plaintiffs, we were litigating a case against the Department of Transportation in Hawaii. And Hawaii also has a constitution that protects the right to a clean and healthful environment. And so we brought this case because while Hawaii has great laws on the books right now to reduce emissions and try to get to zero emissions by 2045, their transportation system was going in the wrong direction and emissions were projected to increase. And so we brought this case and we were about a month out from trial. And because of our work on the ground there and with an incredible team of experts, including local scientists and indigenous practitioners, and this amazing crew of plaintiffs, 13 youth plaintiffs, most of whom are Native Hawaiian, we were able to enter into a settlement agreement with the state where the director of the Department of Transportation and the governor came together with the youth and agreed to fully decarbonize their transportation system by 2045 in what is really a historic settlement agreement. It's the first of its kind in the world, where we now have the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary all working hand in hand in Hawaii with the youth to ensure that they get to zero emissions in their inter-island air and marine transportation, as well as their ground transportation systems. And the settlement agreement maps out the plan of how they're going to do that. And so I just want to take a moment and show you this slide because the power of science in these cases is so incredible. We had 10 experts who prepared expert reports that were going to be their testimony at trial. And it included leading transportation experts around the country, the energy transition decarbonization experts, climate and coral reef experts, people talking about how biodiversity is being harmed. And then we had the health experts. We brought in both Western and Indigenous practitioners to tell the story of the health injuries. And we had experts on the Indigenous Native Hawaiian culture and how that was being harmed because of the changes to the climate. And that was a huge part of the youth stories that they told as well. And you'll get to see a little bit of that in a moment. So what makes this settlement agreement really remarkable and historic is there's a declaration in this agreement that these youth have a fundamental right to a climate system that sustains life. That right is defined by really the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and 350 parts per million being a planetary boundary. The parties agreed that the state would take all actions necessary to get to that zero emissions target by 2045. The court agreed to supervise the settlement agreement through 2045, which means there's now a bit of a marriage between the judge, the state political branches, and these youth and their attorneys for the next 20 years to make sure that Hawaii hits its targets and stays on track with implementation. And it really is a leadership model of what can be done when governments come together with their youth to partner and have the law mean something and really make sure that the commitments are implemented. And so right now, we're working with the state. They're preparing a plan, and they've hired new staff, which was part of the agreement. So it's really incredible, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But first, I want to show you a story of one of the plaintiffs.
It's not a ball fiddle. We are in Hakipu'u on Oahu. I was born and raised on this farm that was granted to one of my ancestors as kuleana lands during the Great Mahele.
This is where I was born and raised. This is a multi-generational farm. This has been our family's farm since time immemorial. We got it through the Kuleana Act, and we've been farming it ever since.
It's kind of just a way for my family to support ourselves, or just like something to use to give back to the community. Get the frog. I think the land is something really important to us, and it's kind of what we see as our way of life. This is part of our stream system, so it's where we get all of our water from. We're having trouble with water right now, so it's really dry. It's supposed to be just constant, fresh running water. It's not running as much as it should be, so it stops right at the beginning over here.
Young people born today are disproportionately impacted by climate change because not only will they have to live with it for much longer than me or any of us in the room, but they will also have much harder consequences on their developing brains and bodies.
So this is one of our patches that is closest to the ocean. Right now it's also affected because of our watering issue. Because it's so close to the ocean and sea level rise, it's having issues with the salinity levels.
So extreme heat, air pollution, climate pollution more generally, that has physical and mental health impacts on children in a way that it doesn't on adults.
Farming kalo, there's drought, there's flooding, there's sea level rise that affects the salinity in our kalo patches. One season, it was really hard where we had to adapt to it and even change our farming style. Like we went to a dryland style, and that's kind of where I realized that it's getting more difficult and it's affecting us in so many ways, and it's just something that needs to be kind of recognized. Being 14 and going up against the DOT, it was really scary. So my mindset now is that no challenge is too big, because the outcome of this case was really positive for me. Like before, I would never do this. I was shy and I would never go up against like the Department of Transportation.
Definitely Nava takes the credit for deciding to do this, because at the end of the day, it was her choice. I guess, being raised here on the farm and actually physically seeing the examples of the climate change, like the effects, I think her life and the parents and grandparents she has is what probably motivated her, instilled in her that she couldn't not do this.
So instead of it being adults speaking for them, they're taking their story and telling the parts of their story that matter to them and telling it to people in power. And our youth plaintiffs tell us that's incredibly empowering. And they feel like maybe for the first time, an adult with power has listened to them.
After putting myself in that position, it kind of changed my mindset that you should just fight for what you believe in, no matter what it is.
So just incredible young people. And I think as Navahine speaks to, she wasn't an activist, really. She describes herself as shy. She was 14 years old. And through this experience, she has had the support of our team and our partners and her family and her community, and has learned how to engage, do civic engagement as a young person, and to tell her story and to feel empowered. And I think it's a common theme among the youth we work with, that many of them don't come to us from an activist background, but they come with a care for the land and a love of their culture and really wanting to make a difference and stand up and find ways to share their stories in places where people in power can listen and make a difference. So that's a big part of what we do at our Children's Trust. And one of the unique things about this settlement process is the agreement with the state requires the Department of Transportation to maintain a youth advisory council for the next 20 years to advise them on their plans, the progress that they're making, to bring new ideas to the table, to give feedback. And it's not just a youth process where they're engaging for a photo op or to get a pat on the back, which is what a lot of these advisory councils kind of end up being for young people. But instead, at their first meeting they attended, the heads of the Department of Transportation said, these are our bosses now to the youth. So there will be a rotating opportunity for young Hawaiians to really engage and dig in with the Department of Transportation. And then their lawyers are there to provide the support and backup with that process. So really meaningful. And then the other thing that we're doing now with educators in Hawaii, which is also a model that we try to replicate in other states and jurisdictions where we work, is teachers love to bring these stories into their classrooms and really connect the dots between the civics that they're teaching and government that they're teaching and the science they're teaching, and the storytelling. And so we're working with, I'm just going to make sure I get the number right here. Right now in Hawaii, we're working in 243 schools, and we'll be able to touch the lives of over 170,000 children who are going to be getting this Navahine curriculum that we're partnering with educators to develop and then distribute, and just bringing in as many of these stories of young people into their classrooms as possible, and doing that in other places as well. So huge role for educators to step in and support this kind of work. And then I'm going to just share with you a couple more cases, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So the Natalie R. versus State of Utah case, this is a right to life case. The state of Utah does not have a provision in their constitution that explicitly protects the right to a clean and healthful environment. And I just want to pause on that for a moment, because we don't have to have written in constitutions that young people have a right to a clean and healthful environment, or a right to a stable climate system or a livable climate. Those don't have to be written in the Constitution to exist. right, and to be rights that young people hold. And the best way I can sort of explain that concept is to speak to all the women on the call right now. So women and the word woman just isn't written in most constitutions. Certainly here in the United States, it's typically absent. And yet the Supreme Court of the United States and state Supreme Courts have said that women or people who aren't male have equal rights to that, the traditional male person who was written about in the early constitutions. And so that's true of a lot of our rights. They're not written down, but they are implicit in the Constitution. And so if you think about the right to life and the right to liberty or personal security or safety, our argument is that that life includes the right to a livable climate and a healthy environment. And so these young Utahns went up before the Utah Supreme Court in September to advocate for that right to life. And we had a really engaging argument. And the issue in Utah is that state requires the development of fossil fuels. They require sort of the maximization of the extraction of fossil fuels in the state. And so we're challenging those laws as unconstitutional and violating the right to life of the youth. And then this is one of our attorneys, Andrew Welly. He recently argued just actually last week in Alaska, a case involving a big LNG project, one of the biggest pipelines that would bring fuel, through Alaska and then for export. And this again is a law that Alaska has on the books saying that they must develop this project. It would, I think, triple the emissions really that Alaska is responsible for. So it's a huge project, and we're suing to stop that project on behalf of Alaska Native youth. And then we have 2 federal cases right now in the works. This is a crew of our youth plaintiffs who are all based in California and are suing the US EPA for basically, the simplest way to say it is that when EPA makes decisions about what levels of pollution to allow, right? EPA's job is to stop pollution and keep our air safe for public health. And EPA makes decisions about how much greenhouse gas pollution or climate pollution to allow. And when it does that, it does an economic analysis that devalues the life of children. So it prioritizes sort of money today in adults' pockets versus the economic value of children who will be alive much longer. So this case is about discrimination, and we're bringing an equal protection claim against the EPA, and we're waiting on a decision from our federal judge right now in that case. And then this may be a case that you've heard of. It's Juliana versus United States. We filed it in 2015. It's nine and a half years and going right now. And we are now in the Supreme Court. And we're asking the Supreme Court to reverse a decision that we got this past summer from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. This case, again, is a case about the right to life and liberty. It's under the US Constitution, and we're challenging the United States federal fossil fuel energy policies that are continuing to promote fossil fuels, subsidize them, allow them to be extracted from our public lands and exported. And so this is a really big case. It was sort of our flagship case for a long time, and it inspired litigation around the world on behalf of youth. And I am totally honored to represent 21 amazing young people who have, for 9 years, been trying to get to trial in this case. So we'll have news about this case coming up. Get on our mailing list so you can hear about the latest later this year. And I think with that, I will just pause and turn it back to to Josh to see if we have questions.
Oh, Julia, thank you so much. You are a planetary treasure, and we are so honored to have you with us. And I have to tell you how many people wrote to me to say how much they were looking forward to hearing from you today. We have a couple of questions. One goes back to the case in Hawaii against the Department of Transportation. And the question is, isn't decarbonization by 2045 a little late or very late?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And what our experts tell us is that if we can get to zero emissions, and I mean zero emissions, so a lot of people will talk about net zero, and net zero is a concept where governments will measure the amount of pollution that's going up in the air from fossil fuels, and then they'll offset it by the amount of sequestration that's happening from forests and wetlands and so forth. And that's not what I'm talking about, just to be clear. We're actually talking about getting to true zero emissions in the energy sectors, including transportation. And our experts say that if we can do that by 2045, 2050 across all sectors, and then really care for the carbon sinks like our forests and our wetlands and our oceans, that we can actually bring temperatures back down pretty quickly, and we can get to more of a stable amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by the end of this century. So it's a long game, right? And it's going to take time, but I don't want people to feel hopeless, right? When we feel like we can't do it in time or we can't do enough, then I think a lot of people shut down. And I'm lucky to talk to some of the smartest scientists on the planet. We have an incredible scientist on our staff who studies glaciers, and there still is a lot to do. And the last thing I'll say about this point is climate change isn't just sort of a moment we get to a certain amount of planetary heating and we're done, right? It's a continuum. And so the more pollution we keep out of the skies and we keep in the ground, the cooler we can keep our planet and the more stable our climate system can be. And so for the sake of our young ones and the children and children to come, we're going to do everything we can to keep as much of that pollution in the ground and protect the carbon sinks throughout the course of the century.
So the settlement with the Hawaiian Department of Transportation is for true zero, not net zero.
True zero.
Yeah, true zero. So there's another question. Is anyone doing this work for Native children on reservations? On our tribal reservation, they're doing remedial work for uranium. It's very concerning, and I just don't think the feds really care.
Yeah, I think it's so hard. I mean, the issues with uranium are very challenging. So there's different parts to that question. We work with energy transition experts who believe that, one, that nuclear power isn't necessary. So the need even for uranium isn't necessary, that wind and solar and existing hydro facilities are enough to power the energy needs, actually, of countries, all the countries around the world. And we just have to harness like the natural power of the sun and wind. But the transition obviously is going to take time and take resources. But there are a lot of people out there thinking really thoughtfully about how to do that. When it comes to remediation of current amounts of pollution, I mean, I do think while there are people within the federal government and state governments who care about these issues, they have to be held to account. There's just so much political pressure from the extraction industry and the pollution-based industry that influences these processes, that it's very hard. So I really feel for you. And then the last issue about working with youth on reservations. So we do represent Indigenous Native youth here in the United States, some of whom live on reservations or have lived on reservations, and we will continue to do that. We don't represent tribes directly, but we do tell the stories of the youth who come from many tribes across the country and also around the world. So thank you for everything you're doing.
Certainly, in the work that you've showed us with children and young people, there is so much hope. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your experience of working with them and maybe the ways in which they've brought you hope, and perhaps how you've seen them evolve and grow in the process of working with you. I know you've touched on that, but I'd love to hear more from you about that, since so many of the people joining us today have devoted their lives to children and young people.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Josh. I think what everyone on our team would say is it's one of the deepest privileges of our lives, and certainly of my life, to be able to represent young people. They are the best clients. As a lawyer, I can tell you hands down, they are the best clients. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. One, as we become adults, we sort of lose vision sometimes, and for what we want the world to be. If we're privileged enough to have a home and food and healthcare and an income, we get busy with our lives, and maybe we don't look far enough ahead in terms of how we might want to help create the world for the next generation. And young people really hold that vision for their future, and every young person I've ever represented has said, I'm doing this for, my younger brother and sister. I'm doing this for people around the world. I'm doing this for children who will come after me so they can live a better life than I have. I mean, they are the most empathic, incredible, people I've ever met. And I think this generation is very, very special in that way, in their appreciation of diversity and the values they hold. They really come from a deep place of love and vision. And they're really wanting to be supported by adults, but not have adults speak for them. So they're coming into the power of their voices and their connections. I think, for better or worse, social media has allowed for young people to really relate to one another in a different way and connect and use their voices. So, I mean, those are some of the reasons they're just incredible, and they're the best authentic storytellers. I think they don't worry so much about what people think about their stories. They tell their stories in an authentic way, and they give the best interviews to reporters. Reporters want to talk to these young people because they're unfiltered and authentic, and it's really meaningful to be in conversation with people who speak so truthfully about who they are and what they want. And they understand law better than a lot of lawyers out there, I'll tell you that.
Wow. I'm so glad that I asked. In our last remaining minutes with you, and I wish we could stay with you forever. I'm sure lots of people with us today are wondering what they can do to move forward this work to protect our planet and our children's future and theirs. And I know you work with not just children and not just with other attorneys, but with people in lots of different sectors. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the work you do with people who do things that are different from you, and what those of us who are in health or mental health or education or early education, what we all can do to be with you and these children and young people in this work.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a few things I'll offer up. This climate emergency that we're living in it's very urgent, but it's not a short-term problem. It's really a long game. And similarly, when we think about law and governance and democracy, that is also a long game, right? It's not like, oh, we win democracy and then we're good. I think we're all seeing that in real time around the world. And changing the law, especially constitutional law and the law that secures just the basic human rights for people, that also is an enduring long-term struggle. And the work that we are doing at Our Children's Trust really builds off of the work of the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement and all these incredible advocates and activists who have come before us, right? Like we are working off of what they have built, but it's going to take time. And so we depend on all kinds of expertise. So whether it's, communication or science, or you're an educator, or you work in the field of trauma, whatever it is, about a third of our budget is pro bono donated services. We don't pay any of our experts. It's really remarkable. They donate 100% of their time. And we're working with incredible people, including, Nobel laureates, because people care so deeply about standing up for these youth. And we're a small team. We're 30 people on our staff. And so all of that extra support really helps power this work. We work with partners, NGOs, medical associations. I could just name 1,000 different types of partners, right? So we love to partner, reach out if you're interested in doing that. We work with artists. So whatever your skill set, we can find a way to work together. And we're not well funded. People often think that, oh, we must be really well funded because of the impact of the work we're doing. But a lot of sort of traditional funders and foundations don't want to fund litigation. And so I just share that because we do need resources. And I know at the end, we'll put our link in if you're interested in learning how to sustain this work and invest in the youth, because we don't charge these young people or their families anything. We do everything free of charge. So we just rely on 100% of community funded, community driven work. And then the last thing I'll say is, please share the stories, whether it's social media or in your workplaces or in your families. Share the stories of our young clients. We have a lot of great resources. And start talking about climate change in terms of fundamental rights and the right to life, because we need to reclaim that concept as one that is meaningful for our children who are living and the children who will come later. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. And so that everybody can share the stories, the recording of today's conversation will be on our Learning to Listen Brassfield Touchpoint Center YouTube page. And we also will post there a link to the full versions of the videos that you saw today. I want to thank you so much, Julia Olson, for sharing your work with us today, and for all you and your organization are doing on behalf of all of our children and their children and our planet. As I said, you are truly a planetary treasure. And I want to thank everybody who's joined us today for all you do for children and their families. And I hope you'll come back on November 20th to listen to Dr. Sandro Galea, physician, epidemiologist, and Dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. He'll share with us what we can learn from the pandemic and its revelations of the conditions in which we live, work, and play, so that together we can create both a better world and better health for everyone.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.